The mirror room. It started as one of those nights where nothing felt out of the ordinary, yet everything had the potential to spiral out of control. Kayla's new apartment had this peculiar charm, mid-century modern with a gothic twist. Her housewarming party was a mix of close friends and the occasional plus one who lurked awkwardly near the snack table. But the star of the apartment wasn't the exposed brick or the clawfoot tub. No, it was the mirror. A massive, floor-to-ceiling antique with an ornate silver frame that practically screamed, "I hold secrets." Came with the place, Kayla had said earlier, brushing off its imposing presence as mere coincidence. But that mirror had a gravity to it, almost like it was alive. It pulled your gaze like a magnet, reflecting back not just your image but something heavier. Maybe it was just the warped glass, or maybe it was the drinks kicking in, but by the time midnight rolled around, the air in the room seemed to buzz, thick with the kind of energy that begged for something reckless. Someone, probably Matt, always the instigator, suggested the game. "One wish, 1 minute," he said, gesturing toward the mirror. "Go in, stand there alone, and think about what you really want. The mirror will show you." He said it half as a joke, but his tone had that edge of drunken sincerity, the kind that makes bad ideas sound brilliant. The first few volunteers went in laughing. Lily came out saying she'd wished for a promotion, her giggles betraying her disbelief in the whole thing. Eric claimed he'd seen a flash of himself in a Ferrari and called it a night. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first, just harmless fun. Until it was Sophie's turn. Sophie wasn't the type to scare easily. She was the grounded one, the kind of friend who rolled her eyes at ghost stories and called them campfire nonsense. But when she came out of that room, her face was pale, her hands shaking. "It's just weird in there," she mumbled, brushing past everyone to grab another drink. That should have been the first red flag, but of course, no one paid attention. The night rolled on, the game turning from light-hearted to something almost ritualistic. Each person who entered the room came out a little different. Matt, usually the loudest guy in the room, was uncharacteristically quiet, staring at the mirror like it had whispered some forbidden truth. Kayla laughed it off, but her eyes darted nervously to the silver frame every few minutes, like she was waiting for something to happen. By the time it was my turn, the energy in the apartment was suffocating. It felt like the walls were closing in, the music from the living room distant and warped. I didn't want to go in. Hell, I wasn't even sure why I'd come to the party in the first place. But there's a certain pressure in moments like that, a silent dare to prove you're not afraid. The room was cold, colder than it had any right to be. The mirror loomed in the dim light, its surface rippling faintly like water disturbed by an unseen hand. I stared at my reflection, and for a moment, it stared back. Not in the way a reflection is supposed to, this was different. The eyes weren't mine, or maybe they were too much mine, like they knew things I'd forgotten. "Think of what you want," I whispered to myself, my breath fogging the glass. But the thing is, I couldn't. Not really. What did I want? Money? Love? To be happy? The words felt hollow, meaningless in the face of that mirror's silent judgment. And then, just as I was about to turn away, the glass shifted. Not physically, no cracks or breaks, but the image it held bent, twisted, became something other. It was still me, but older. Tired. My eyes were sunken, my skin pallid. And in the background, the apartment wasn't empty. Shadows moved, dark and hulking, their forms just vague enough to make my heart race. I stumbled out of the room, the sound of my own heartbeat drowning out the music. No one asked what I'd seen, and I didn't offer. But from that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out. The party ended not long after that. People trickled out, their laughter forced and strained. Sophie left without saying goodbye, and Matt spent the rest of the night staring at the mirror like it owed him answers. By the time I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My apartment, normally cozy, felt foreign, hostile even. Every shadow seemed too dark, every creak of the floorboards too deliberate. I avoided mirrors entirely, afraid of what I might see. And then the dreams started. The dreams were not nightmares, at least not in the traditional sense. They felt too vivid, too calculated. Every night, I found myself back in the mirror room, but it wasn't Kayla's apartment anymore. The room stretched endlessly, the mirror no longer confined to one wall. It surrounded me, closing in on all sides, reflecting angles that didn't make sense. My reflection watched me, but it didn't move when I moved. It stood still, staring with those same hollow eyes I'd seen before. The whispers came next, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves. But they grew louder, more insistent, until the sound wrapped around me, suffocating and intimate. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, yet the meaning crawled into my mind like an infection. I woke up drenched in sweat, my chest tight as though I'd forgotten how to breathe. The clock by my bedside always read the same time, 3:13. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I'd had too much to drink at the party. Maybe the stress of work was catching up with me. But the feeling that something was wrong lingered, growing stronger with each passing day. It wasn't just me, everyone who had played the game seemed off. I saw Sophie a few days later, but she wasn't Sophie anymore. Her laugh was forced, her movements too stiff, like a marionette trying to mimic life. She kept glancing at her phone, even when it didn't buzz, and when I asked her about the party, she froze, her face a mask of polite disinterest. "What party?" she asked, her voice flat. Matt wasn't much better. He'd always been the life of the group, cracking jokes and throwing out movie quotes at every opportunity. Now he barely spoke. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling when he reached for his coffee. When I asked if he was okay, he gave me a thin smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Just tired," he muttered before quickly changing the subject. Even Kayla, who had seemed so carefree, looked haunted. I caught her outside her apartment one evening, chain-smoking with a wild look in her eyes. She didn't notice me at first, and when I called her name, she jumped like I'd startled her out of some terrible thought. "I think I'm going to sell the place," she blurted, her voice shaky. "Why? You just moved in." Her gaze darted toward the window, where the faint outline of the mirror was visible behind the curtains. "It's the mirror," she whispered, almost too quietly to hear. "Something's wrong with it. I don't know how to explain it, but I can't stay here anymore." I wanted to press her for details, but the fear in her eyes stopped me. She looked like someone on the edge, teetering between sanity and something darker. Instead, I nodded, offering her a weak smile. "Maybe that's a good idea," I said, though the words felt hollow. That night, I avoided my own reflection again. The bathroom mirror was covered with a towel, and I kept the lights off as I brushed my teeth. But it didn't matter. I could still feel it, the pull of that other version of me, watching from somewhere just out of sight. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. The dreams were getting worse, bleeding into my waking life. I saw flashes of the mirror in every reflective surface, shop windows, puddles, even the gloss of my phone screen. And always, that warped version of me stared back. I called Matt first, but he didn't pick up. Sophie's number went straight to voicemail. Desperate, I tried Kayla. She answered on the third ring, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think we need to talk," I said, my words tumbling out in a rush. "About the mirror. Something's happening, and I don't know what to do." There was a long pause, and for a moment, I thought she might hang up. Then she said, "Come over. But don't bring anyone else." When I arrived, the apartment looked different. The once lively space felt hollow, the furniture casting long, jagged shadows in the dim light. Kayla stood by the mirror, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She didn't look at me when I walked in. "I've been trying to get rid of it," she said, her voice raw. "I've called antique dealers, junk removal services, even a priest. No one will touch it. It's like they know." "Know what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. She finally turned to face me, her eyes rimmed with red. "That it doesn't just reflect. It keeps things. Pieces of us. And it lets something else out. I didn't want to believe her, but deep down, I knew she was right. We'd opened some kind of door that night, and now it wouldn't close. The silence between us was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the mirror, a sound so low it was more a feeling than a noise. I stepped closer, my reflection swimming into view. It looked normal at first, tired, scared, but normal. And then it blinked. I hadn't blinked. Kayla yanked me back from the mirror so hard I nearly fell. Her grip was ice cold, trembling like she was holding on to sanity by a thread. "Don't," she hissed, her voice sharp and desperate. "The more you look, the more it sees you." I wanted to argue, to tell her she was overreacting, but my throat closed up, and the words stuck there like jagged glass. I couldn't shake the image of my reflection blinking out of sync, like it was waiting for me to notice. Kayla started pacing, rubbing her arms like she was freezing. "I don't know what it wants, but it's getting stronger. Every time I try to leave, it pulls me back. It's like it knows I'm trying to escape." Her voice cracked, and I realized she was crying. A wave of guilt hit me. This had started as some stupid party game, a chance to show off her new place. None of us had any idea what we were messing with, and now it felt like we'd unleashed something we couldn't control. "We have to do something," I said, though I wasn't sure what that something was. Smash the mirror? Burn it? Call an exorcist? The ideas felt ridiculous even as I thought them. Kayla shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "I tried. I broke it once, but it just healed. Like nothing ever happened." And then, she stopped, swallowing hard. "Then it showed me things. Things I never told anyone. Things that didn't even feel like mine." I didn't know what to say. My skin crawled, and the room felt colder than it should have. The mirror loomed behind her, its surface gleaming like liquid mercury. It seemed to pulse faintly, as if it were alive and breathing. "Have you seen them?" Kayla asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Seen what?" "The others. The ones that look like us, but aren't." My stomach twisted. "In the reflections?" She nodded. "They're always there. Watching. Waiting." And sometimes, her voice trailed off, and she stared at the mirror with hollow eyes. "Sometimes they come out." I froze, her words ricocheting in my skull. It felt absurd, like the plot of some B-grade horror movie. But when I thought about Sophie's unnatural smile, Matt's dead eyes, and my own reflection blinking on its own, I couldn't dismiss it. "What if we're already too late?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Kayla looked at me, her expression raw and terrified. "Then we're already them." The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I backed away from the mirror, every nerve in my body screaming to run, to get as far away from that cursed thing as possible. But I didn't move. I couldn't. "Maybe it's not about destroying it," I said after a long silence. "Maybe we need to understand it. Figure out what it wants." Kayla laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and jagged. "And how do you plan to do that? Ask it nicely?" I didn't have an answer. But standing there, feeling the mirror's silent pull, I knew one thing for sure, we couldn't just leave it. It wouldn't let us. "Have you been back in?" I asked suddenly. Her head snapped up, her face pale. "Are you insane?" "Think about it," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "If it takes something from us, maybe we can take something back. Maybe we can find out what's behind it." Kayla stared at me like I'd lost my mind, and maybe I had. But the idea had taken root, stubborn and unshakable. The only way to beat this thing was to face it head-on. "Fine," she said after what felt like an eternity. "But if this goes wrong?" "It's already wrong," I interrupted, glancing at the mirror. "This is our only chance. We stood side by side, the mirror stretching before us like an endless black lake. The air around it felt thick, heavy, like stepping into the eye of a storm. I clenched my fists, steeling myself, and then, without another word, I stepped forward. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the world shifted. The apartment melted away, replaced by a void so dark it felt like the absence of existence itself. The only light came from the mirror, now a doorway, its surface rippling like water. Kayla was right behind me, her breaths quick and shallow. "Where are we?" she whispered, though the words seemed to vanish into the emptiness. "I don't know," I said, my voice sounding small. The reflections were everywhere, shimmering and distorted. They surrounded us, moving in ways that defied logic. Some looked like me, others like Kayla, but none of them felt real. They were exaggerated, twisted versions, their eyes too wide, their smiles too sharp. And then one of them stepped forward. It wasn't me, but it was close enough to make my stomach churn. The thing moved with jerky, unnatural precision, its head tilting as if it were studying me. "What do you want?" I demanded, though my voice wavered. It didn't answer. Instead, it smiled, a slow, eerie grin that made my skin crawl. Kayla grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to go," she said, panic rising in her voice. But before we could move, the thing lunged, and the world exploded into chaos. The thing collided with me like a wave of freezing water, its touch seeping into my skin, its presence flooding my mind. For a moment, I couldn't tell where I ended and it began. Memories flashed before me, some mine, some foreign, others warped and fragmented. It was like someone had taken my life, shredded it, and reassembled it with jagged, mismatched edges. Kayla's scream cut through the fog in my head, sharp and piercing. I wrenched myself free, stumbling back into her. The thing that had attacked me stood motionless now, its head tilted as though amused. Behind it, the other reflections moved closer, their distorted forms flickering like static. "We have to leave," Kayla shouted, pulling me toward the mirror's rippling surface. But when I turned to follow, the doorway was gone. The mirror was still there, but now it reflected only the endless void surrounding us, trapping us inside. Kayla clawed at the air, her hands trembling as she pounded against the invisible barrier. "No, no, no. This can't be happening." Her voice cracked, and she collapsed to her knees, her sobs echoing in the silence. I wanted to comfort her, to say something reassuring, but my throat was dry, and my own fear was a noose tightening around me. The reflections moved closer, their faces impossibly calm, their eyes gleaming with something that felt almost curious. Then one of them spoke. Its voice wasn't human, it was layered, echoing, as though 1,000 whispers were trying to form a single word. "Why do you resist?" Kayla froze, her breath hitching. I stepped in front of her instinctively, my body shielding hers. "What do you want from us?" I demanded, though my voice shook. The reflection of me, the one that had attacked, took a step closer. Its grin widened, splitting its face unnaturally. "We are you," it said, the words slithering into my ears like venom. "And you are us." "That's not an answer," I snapped, though my legs felt like they might give out at any moment. Kayla rose shakily to her feet, gripping my arm. "This is a trap," she whispered. "It doesn't want anything. It just is." But that didn't make sense. Things like this didn't just exist without purpose, without reason. I turned back to the reflections, searching their faces for a clue, a crack in their perfect, eerie facades. "Why the game?" I asked suddenly. "Why let us come in, one by one? Why not just take us all at once?" The reflections paused, their movements stuttering like a broken film reel. The one that looked like Kayla stepped forward this time, its lips curling into something that might have been a smile. "The game is your choice," it said. "You come willingly. You always do." Kayla's grip tightened on my arm, and I felt her nails digging into my skin. "This isn't real," she muttered, more to herself than to me. "It's a trick." a hallucination. But it felt real. Too real. The cold air, the static-like hum that filled the void, the weight of their gazes, it pressed down on me, suffocating and undeniable. I took a step forward, toward the thing that wore my face. If we're the ones choosing, then we can choose to leave. The reflection tilted its head, that unnatural grin still plastered across its face. Leaving requires balance, it said cryptically. Balance? Kayla asked, her voice rising in frustration. What the hell does that mean? The reflection didn't answer. Instead, it raised its hand, pointing to the mirror. Its surface began to ripple again, and an image formed of us. Kayla and me, back in the apartment, laughing and drinking with the others. But something was off. The Kayla in the reflection looked wrong. Her movements were too smooth, too deliberate. And when she smiled, it didn't reach her eyes. That's not us, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It is now, the reflection replied, stepping closer. You belong here. They belong there. Kayla's breathing quickened, and I felt her panic rising like a tidal wave. No, she said, shaking her head. No, no, no. We're not staying here. But the reflections moved as one, closing the distance between us. Their forms flickered and warped, their features shifting into something darker, more grotesque. They were no longer imitations of us, they were something else entirely, something primal and ancient. Run! I shouted, grabbing Kayla's hand. We bolted toward the mirror, the void twisting and writhing around us. The reflections followed, their movements impossibly fast, their distorted faces grinning with predatory glee. The mirror loomed ahead, its surface still rippling like liquid glass. I didn't know if it would let us through, but it was our only chance. As we reached it, Kayla hesitated, pulling back. What if it's a trap? She cried, her voice filled with desperation. It's all a trap! I yelled, dragging her forward. We don't have a choice. I threw myself into the mirror, the cold surface swallowing me whole. For a moment, there was nothing, just darkness and the sensation of falling. And then I was back in the apartment. The warmth of the room hit me like a shock, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses filling the air. I turned, expecting to see Kayla, but she wasn't there. Hey, a voice said behind me. I spun around to see her standing by the mirror, her face calm, her smile serene. But something about her eyes. They weren't hers. I stared at Kayla, my breath catching in my throat. She looked the same, her messy blonde hair, the faint scar above her eyebrow from when she fell off her bike as a kid, even the necklace she always wore, the one her grandmother had given her. But her eyes, they were too still, too knowing, as if she were seeing things I couldn't. Kayla? I asked cautiously, taking a step toward her. She tilted her head, just like the reflections in the mirror had done, and for a moment, her smile faltered. I'm fine, she said, her voice light, almost too casual. A little shaken up, but fine. It was a lie. I knew it. She knew it. But no one else seemed to notice. The others were laughing, oblivious to the fact that we had just come back from wherever the hell that was. To them, everything was normal. The music still played softly in the background, the drinks still sat half-finished on the coffee table, and the apartment was still bathed in the warm glow of the overhead lights. I turned to Jake, who was leaning back on the couch, a lazy grin on his face. Jake, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Did you see us go through the mirror? He blinked at me, confused. What are you talking about? You've been here the whole time. No, we haven't, I insisted. We went into the mirror room. You saw us. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. Dude, are you drunk? You never left. Neither of you did. My stomach dropped. I glanced at Kayla, hoping for some sort of confirmation, some shared understanding that we weren't losing our minds. But she just stood there, staring at me with that same eerie calm. Something was wrong. I grabbed her arm, pulling her aside. Her skin was cold, colder than it should have been. "Kayla," I whispered urgently. "That wasn't real, right? What we saw, what happened, it wasn't real." She looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. And then she leaned in close, her breath brushing against my ear. "Maybe we were never real to begin with." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I let go of her, stumbling back as she turned and walked away, her movements unnervingly graceful. The room spun around me, the laughter of our friends now grating and distant. I pressed my hands to my head, trying to make sense of everything. Was I losing my mind? Had we imagined the entire thing? Or had we brought something back with us, something that wasn't supposed to leave? I turned back to the mirror, now just a large, ornate frame hanging on the wall. Its surface was smooth, reflecting the room behind me. But as I stared into it, I saw something move. It was quick, a flicker in the corner of the glass, but it was enough to make my heart stop. I stepped closer, my reflection staring back at me with wide, terrified eyes. And then I saw it. My reflection blinked. I hadn't. Panic surged through me, my chest tightening as I backed away from the mirror. But no one else seemed to notice. They were all laughing, talking, drinking, as if nothing had happened. And maybe, for them, nothing had. But for me, everything had changed. Kayla was no longer Kayla. And I wasn't sure I was still me. The laughter around me grew louder, harsher, until it felt like it was clawing at my ears. I pressed my hands over them, squeezing my eyes shut, but the sound wouldn't stop. When I opened my eyes again, the room was empty. The mirror was gone. And I was alone.